Okay, so get this. Imagine a digital currency.
Uh-huh.
And depending just on how you got hold of it, right, it could be worth, say, $1.
Okay. Like a standard market price.
Or maybe like hundreds of thousands of dollars, both
Yeah.
values, at the exact same time.
Wow. Okay. That sounds, well, it definitely challenges how we usually think about asset value, doesn't it?
Yeah, kind of wild, isn't it? And that's the really fascinating, maybe ambitious concept we're diving into today. Pi Network's proposed dual value system.
Right. And we're basing this discussion on a specific source, an article by Dimas Nawawi, which is also discussed in a YouTube video.
Yeah.
It really lays out this unique mechanism.
So our goal here today is pretty straightforward. Let's try to unpack exactly how this system is, well, meant to work, according to the source anyway.
Yeah, figure out what's driving these two, potentially very different values.
And what it all means for you if you're holding Pi or maybe thinking about acquiring some.
All right, let's jump right in then. The core concept, the absolute fundamental idea presented here, is that Pi is actually designed to have two distinct values operating at the same time.
Two values,
Yeah.
not just, the one price you might see fluctuating on an exchange.
Exactly. The source talks about the first one as being, well, significantly higher.
Yeah.
This value is designated for use inside the main Pi network ecosystem.
And that's the big number people talk about.
That's the one. $314,159 per Pi. It's often referred to as the GCV.
GCV, Global Consensus Value Rate.
That's it, yeah, global consensus value.
$300,000. Okay, so according to the source, what is that huge value actually tied to? How do you get Pi that's worth that much?
Well, according to this explanation, the GCV isn't just for any Pi.
Yeah.
It's specifically tied to Pi that you earn through certain contributions within the ecosystem itself.
Contribution. Like what sort of things?
Think about the activities involved in building and maintaining the network. So the initial mining process on the app, successfully doing your KYC verification, actively building up your security circle, maybe running a node if you're technically inclined, locking up your Pi for a set period.
Right, committing it.
And also just engaging with the ecosystem, like exploring dApps, using the Pi browser, those kinds of active participation.
So it's value linked directly to effort and participation in the network, not just, buying the coin somewhere.
That seems to be the crucial distinction the source is making. It frames this GCV not as some arbitrary number, but supposedly linked to programming documents found within the Pi App Store. And it's also connected, at least in theory, to the future launch of something called the supernode.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the high GCV for contribution-based Pi used inside the ecosystem. What about the second value?
The second value is much more, well, conventional. It's basically the market price.
The price you'd see on CoinMarketCap or an exchange.
Exactly. Determined by normal supply and demand on crypto exchanges. The source uses $1 USD, just as an example, for illustration. Obviously, that price would fluctuate wildly in a real market.
And this market price, the $1 example, that applies specifically to Pi being traded on those external exchanges.
Precisely. The source is quite specific here. This market price applies where exchanges have put in place standard KYC and AML checks.
Know your customer, anti-money laundering, standard stuff.
Right. And importantly, these exchanges need to have an API code. This code apparently allows the main Pi system to identify the source of the Pi being traded there, that it came from an exchange.
Okay, so the system needs to know if the Pi came from inside via contribution or outside via an exchange. That makes sense if there are two values.
Yeah, that distinction seems key. High GCV for internal contributions, variable market price for external exchange activity.
So how is this all supposed to, work in practice? It sounds complex.
Well, the source gives a pretty dramatic example to illustrate the difference. It really highlights it.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you want to buy something really expensive, like a luxury car.
Yeah.
Let's use their value, $314,159.
Right, the GCV value.
And you want to buy it from a decentralized application, a dApp, that's built inside the main Pi ecosystem. So a vendor accepting Pi within the network.
Gotcha, a Pi ecosystem shop.
Okay. Scenario one, you've got Pi, but you bought it. You purchased it on an exchange, let's say OKX, where the market price is currently $1 per Pi.
So you just went out and bought a whole load of Pi off the open market.
Yep. Now, according to the source material, the Pi system itself, maybe using AI or some intermediary, relying on that exchange's API code, is designed to recognize this specific Pi you're trying to spend.
It flags it as exchange Pi.
Essentially, yes. Exchange sourced. So to buy that $314,159 car using this Pi,
You need 314,159 of them.
Exactly. You'd need 314,159 Pi coins because each one is only recognized at its $1 market purchase value in this context. $314,159 divided by $1 per Pi.
Okay, that math works out based on the market price. Straightforward enough. What's scenario 2?
Scenario 2 is where things get, well, different. Here, you're using Pi that you earned yourself through your own contributions inside Core Pi ecosystem.
So the Pi you mined got KYC'd for, that migrated to your wallet, your contribution Pi.
Yes, exactly that. The system, as the source explains it, is built to recognize this Pi differently. It knows it's contribution-based because of how it originated.
And for the same car?
To buy the exact same $314,159 car inside that same DApp, according to this proposed system, you would only need to spend 1 Pi coin.
Wow. Okay, hold on. 1 Pi for a $314,159 asset. That's the GCV value in action then.
That's precisely the point the source makes. It's a really stark difference, isn't it?
It is.
Because that single Pi coin, due to its origin story, basically coming from your contribution efforts within the ecosystem, it's treated as holding that massive 314,159 DCV, but critically, only within that core ecosystem context.
So the system isn't just counting Pi coins in your wallet. It's like it's tracking the biography of each coin, where it came from.
That seems to be the core technical claim being put forward in the source, yes. The system is supposedly designed to distinguish the source of the Pi you're using.
And it only applies that huge GCV value to the contribution-based Pi, and only when it's used inside the network's own apps and services.
That's the model described.
Okay, this naturally leads to the big question. Why? Why set up such a, frankly, convoluted system? What's the point of even listing Pi on exchanges at a market price if the real value inside is meant to be so much higher?
That's a fair question. The main reason given in the source material for listing Pi on exchanges, even at a lower market price, is essentially for visibility.
Like marketing, getting the name out there.
Yeah, achieving widespread awareness and driving adoption for the Pi cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Make it accessible, get people talking about it.
Let people buy it easily on platforms they already use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a really crucial point. The source emphasizes there's a catch, or rather a next step required for those exchange buyers.
Okay.
New users who get their Pi from an exchange are apparently expected to then register, download the actual Pi app, and complete the KYCML verification process within the core system.
Why do they need to do that if they already bought the Pi?
According to the source, this is necessary for them to participate fully in the core ecosystem, to become a real pioneer.
And does that unlock something?
It's framed as the pathway to potentially earning or using the contribution-based Pi later on the Pi that does qualify for the higher GCV value within the ecosystem. They need to be onboarded properly into the network itself.
And what if they just buy Pi on an exchange and never download the app or do KYC?
The source clarifies that if they don't complete those steps, they're basically stuck using their Pi only at whatever the going market rate is on the exchanges.
So they can trade it, maybe, but they can't use it within the ecosystem dApps at that high GCV value.
That seems to be the limitation described. No access to the intended higher utility value without becoming a verified part of the core network.
Okay, that helps clarify the journey from being just a market buyer to an actual network participant. What about some practicalities? The source must touch on those. Like, is it safe to send Pi you bought on an exchange to your main Pi wallet? Will it mess things up?
Yeah, the source addresses that directly. It says, yes, it's safe. The claim is that the system is designed to keep track of the two types, contribution-based and exchange-purchased, even if they're mixed together in the same wallet.
Really? So it remembers the origin forever, not just the current location?
Apparently so. It's the origin story, not the wallet address, that defines the Pi's type and potential value within the system, according to this explanation.
Okay, that's a significant technical assertion. What if, say, my friend sends me some Pi they mined? How's that classified when I receive it?
The source says that Pi received from another pioneer, assuming it was originally contribution-based Pi, retains that classification.
Because its ultimate origin was inside the ecosystem activities, not an external exchange.
Exactly. So it would still carry the potential for the GCV value when used within the ecosystem dApps.
Interesting. The lineage matters. How about bigger players, companies, institutions? How are they supposed to interact with this dual system?
Well, according to the source, they basically have the same kind of options as individuals. They could, for instance, run nodes to support the network.
And earn contribution-based pi that way.
Right, which would then potentially qualify for the GCV when used internally, or the alternative route.
Just buy it on the market.
Yeah, they can simply acquire pi by purchasing it on exchanges, just like anyone else. But in that case, the pi they buy would only hold the market price value.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned using the GCV pi inside the ecosystem. Does the source say anything about converting that high-value pi back into, regular money, fiat currency?
It does mention that. There's a stated plan, apparently from the core team, described in the source. The idea is to allow conversion of GCV-valued pi into fiat
Wow.
through selected major exchanges that become like deeply integrated partners within the core ecosystem.
Okay, but at what rate? At the full $314,159.
Well, this is where it gets a bit more complex. The source mentions a range for potential fiat conversion. It says something like $3 to $314 per pi.
Whoa, hang on. $3 to $314, but the GCV is over 300,000. That's a massive difference.
Is a huge potential discrepancy, yeah.
Does the source explain why there's such a potential drop? Or what determines if someone gets $3 versus $314 for their GCV pi? That seems critical.
The source presents this $3 to $314 range as the stated plan for fiat conversion, but it doesn't really dig into the specifics of why it's that range or the mechanics behind it.
So it doesn't explain how that GCV translates or fails to translate into actual fiat cash-out value.
Not in detail, no. It's more presented as, like, this is the proposed feature and this is the potential output range for fiat conversion when it happens. It definitely leaves you wondering about the practical value realization outside the ecosystem.
Yeah, big time. And were there limits mentioned on these conversions?
Yes, the source does mention daily limits for these fiat conversions, ranging from $10 up to $10,000 per day.
Okay, daily limits. And what about just spending the GCV pi within the ecosystem dApps, like buying things, not cashing out?
For that, the source mentions a concept of a pi bank within the ecosystem. The idea there is for shopping without those specific daily fiat conversion limits.
So potentially unlimited spending inside.
Well, it adds a caveat. It says this would still depend on the capacity of the dApps themselves to handle the transaction volume. Why dApp capacity would be a bottleneck specifically for shopping compared to fiat conversion isn't fully fleshed out either in the source material we reviewed.
More questions there. This structure also brings up the issue of whales, right? People or groups holding huge amounts of pi. How does the source address pi bought in bulk from exchanges?
It tackles that head on, actually. Uses a specific example. Imagine a whale who holds, say, 300 million pi coins.
Okay, massive amount.
And they bought all of it on exchanges at that example price of $1 per pi. So that represents $300 million in market value.
Sounds like they could have a lot of influence holding that much.
In market terms, yes, it's a huge position. But the source then immediately contrasts this. It argues that this entire $300 million market value is actually equivalent in ecosystem value to only about 955 contribution-based pi coins.
Wait, how? Oh, right. 955 times the $314,159 GC?
Exactly. 955 times $314,159 is roughly $300 million.
So the source frames that huge pile of exchange-bought pi as having the same internal worth as less than 1,000 earned pi.
That's precisely the perspective presented. It minimizes the significance of large exchange holdings in terms of the core ecosystem's value system.
How do they spin that positively?
The source actually concludes that point by suggesting that the more pi these wheels accumulate from exchanges, the better it is for other pioneers.
Oh.
Because, it argues, it makes pi scarcer overall. So hoarding exchange-bought pi is portrayed as a good thing for scarcity.
That's certainly an interesting take on large holders buying up supply externally. Okay, so if you try to boil all this down, the main takeaway from the source about this dual system seems to be what?
It really boils down to this fundamental intended separation. That extremely high GCV number, the $314,159, is supposedly reserved only for pi that's earned through active contribution inside the core Pi network ecosystem.
And used there.
And used there, right?
Right.
Whereas any pi you just acquire by buying it on an external exchange, that pi carries the fluctuating market price determined by supply and demand like any other crypto.
And it has different rules or limitations on how it can be used, especially regarding that high internal value.
Exactly. Different origins, different potential values, different utilities, according to this model.
It's definitely a unique and pretty complex model they're outlining there.
It absolutely requires you to think about value in a way that's, well, quite different from most typical financial markets or even other crypto projects we see.
So this deep dive, really leaning on the source material from Dimas Nawawi, gives us this detailed picture of Pi Network's proposed dual value system. It kind of forces you, the listener, to consider what value even means in this specific context.
Right. And the source, especially in its conclusions, seems to frame that active contribution, the mining, the KYC, the node, running as the source of, quote, true value. It calls it a treasure for those who earn it that way.
Yeah, and it sets that in stark contrast to just, buying Pi off the market like you might buy Bitcoin or Ether.
Which really leaves us with a provocative thought, doesn't it? What does this whole philosophy suggest about the project's underlying goals and how it's trying to incentivize people?
Is it fundamentally about rewarding network building and long-term participation over just, say, market speculation? And maybe more importantly, how could this unusual dual definition of value realistically play out in terms of adoption, usability, and just general public perception down the line?
Lots to think about there. Definitely not your standard crypto model.
Indeed. Something for you to mull over after listening today.